land. And I believe it's quite symbolic that today, when we mark a very specific date, we believe this to be the commemorative celebration of the baptizing of ancient Rus. And today we discuss the violations and crimes committed by the Russians when they ruin churches. And partially, of course, this is the crime of war, and on the other hand, this is the crime of ethos, so to say. And with this, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Ihor Kozlovskyi, the religion analyst. I'm happy to welcome everybody. This is the first time when we celebrate the Day of the State, or the Ukrainian Statehood Day. On the other hand, this day and this date coincides with another commemorating date, the date when Christianity was adopted as the Christian religion for these lands long ago. And today we see that this is the battle between values, between the values which are aiming the future, which stretch into the future, with the values of the past, the values of looking back into the 19th century. Actually, the objective of the occupants was to destroy our identity, while the spiritual values are part of that, our national identity, and the vision of this war by Russia. One of the fundamentals of this war for Russia is to substitute the reality in which we exist with some chimerous ideas. Those chimerous ideas actually, for Russia, this is the material which substantializes the right for Russia to occupy the land. And actually, today we observe how the spectrum of multiple religions, which had been the peculiarity of Ukraine for ages, today is under threat, actually. And one of the ways to do this is to ruin the religious buildings which belong to different religions. But this is only one aspect, because the religious life in the occupied territories is under threat. And today we observe the systemic repressions and oppressions against those who do not match their picture, the picture of the Russian world invented by the Russian ideologists. Also, the occupants applied the strategy of kidnapping, and they're kidnapping priests of many denominations. Also, the encourage people to write fake submissions on the priests, and they keep the kidnapped hostages in the places where conditions are unbearable. They torture them, and quite often later on we cannot find those priests who were kidnapped, who were kept like hostages, who were tortured, and most probably they were killed. Actually, partially, this represents the vision of the Russian world, so-called the ideology of the Moscow Patriarch Orthodoxy, the vision that it has on other religions. This damage to the religious buildings, which was a distinctive feature of their policy in the occupied lands since 2015. It had preserved in the occupied territories today, and we do not know as of this moment how many religious buildings, churches, synagogues, and other religious premises were destroyed. And we should not just register the ruined buildings. We should check the damage. This is true for those territories which are deoccupied already. So we have to make an assessment whether it is possible to repair those churches, or the overhaul is impossible, and we have to demolish them and to build something new. This work involves not only the effort of the civil society, but also this should become part of the dialogue with the governmental structures in order to develop the action plan, what to do next, what to do after liberation. And of course, we should keep the international community informed about what's going on, and not just inform them, but also to allow donors, sponsors who might be willing to sponsor the repairs and overhauls of damaged churches to contribute to such development, and to rescue those religious buildings which it is possible to rescue. The religious life in the occupied territories is almost suspended now. Even the priests of the Moscow Patriarchy, Ukrainian Church of Moscow Patriarchy, in the occupied territories quite often are invited to the political authorities of the occupying state, and strongly instructed how they should act, while other denominations, they actually felt oppressed and threatened by the occupants. I think this is a very tragic reality. So today's conference was organized to express our voice of support to those religious communities, to those who promote spiritual life in the occupied lands, and to remind to public at large that all those actions are deemed to be the crimes of war and crimes against humanity. Thank you. This is to mark that we are launching a big work on the registration of damages to religious buildings, and this work brought together several civil society organizations and church organizations. The Institute of Religious Freedoms had started one of these projects. Then also registration of damages committed to the religious buildings is carried out by the state, by Ukrainian state, and I'm pleased to give the floor to Mr. Viacheslav Horshkov, who is an expert from the State Service of Ukraine on ethnopolitics and the freedom of faith. And he will present the state's point of view. Thank you. I would like to remind that the adoption of Christianity is considered to be an important action which launched the formation of statehood here. And since that moment, many ethical norms, ethos norms were accepted as values in the society, and part of that ethos were the norms of the war, the rules of the war. And I would like to remind you that almost 1,000 years ago, that rules of war, which were backed up with the ideas of Christianity, they were more human than the ones which are kept today by the Russian occupants. Almost from the very first day of the war, we received news about the ruinations of churches, and it took us some time to understand our new role under the war conditions, and one of the first and natural tasks for us was to register, to observe the damage done to the church buildings, and to observe the religious life in war conditions. And from early March, we started to issue the news updates on the situation, with the growth of the number of ruined churches, we established connection with the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy, and started to contribute to their list of religious buildings, and not just on the religious communities, but or religious objects like cemeteries, like crosses installed to commemorate some religious event. But we focused our attention on the premises which were used for prayer, like seminaries, like prayer houses, and churches per se. And very soon we found that from the moment when each territory became occupied, all the connections and all the information was ruined, and quite often it's not even clear whether the person with whom you contacted before, for example, a priest of the church or a congregation who is unable to contact you, why he or she is unable to contact you, whether because he is not alive anymore or just because the connection is disrupted. And that's why we try to establish connection with the managers from local administrations. Very soon it became clear that we won't manage this task without external help, that we had not enough personnel. That's why I was very happy when Ruslan established contact with me and suggested to launch a joint project. So our idea was first to develop what information is important, what we should present for the decision making and for their information purposes. So first we had to decide what was the objective, whether just to inform the policymakers or to collect the proofs or evidence for future files to court. So very soon I discovered that the Ministry of Information Policy was presenting collected information about the occupied territories and Ukraine's losses as a state on the map. So they were mapping what was going on. And quite soon we understood that while with the bigger churches, it was quite easy to indicate the address of the religious building. Then in small villages, in rural areas, it was quite difficult to find the building. So establishing the geographical coordinates of such objects was not that easy as we imagined before that. So that required additional efforts from us, and we involved other organizations, other teams. Quite often we have to double check the information that we get from people. Quite often it was necessary to find the evidence that something happened to this or that religious building. since we are collecting this all data for the future court proceedings, and we hope that such court proceedings will take place in future, we want to collect the all the necessary evidence, the appearance, the view of the church religious building before the occupation, then after the damage was committed, and also to find the proof that that was done, the damage was done by the enemy's troops, not by Ukrainian armed forces. For example, you have to register that the church was under occupation, or the shell projectile came from the positions of Russian forces, etc. We'll hope that we'll see the courts about that damage committed to religious buildings in our lifetime. And I would like to use this opportunity and to ask all the religious communities of all denominations to inform us about this damage which was committed by the Russian forces to your religious buildings, because we hope to get a sort of compensations for them. Thank you. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that this is quite difficult work, and those civil society organizations which are involved into the project, they act according to some algorithms. They double check the information. Quite often the news which they get, this about religious buildings which stay in the occupied territories. Sometimes the information comes from the social networks, and even when we speak about the liberated territories, we have to go there to visit the site, to register what happened, to interview the witnesses, to establish the circumstances, how the damage happened, who was shooting in the moment when the damage was committed. And I'm giving the floor to Ruslan Khalikov, who will describe this on-site visits. I would like to emphasize that today we are emphasizing on the damage of the damage to religious buildings, not just because we love the religious buildings, but because the damage to religious buildings is violation of the humanitarian law, and from the international legislation point of view, from the international criminal law point of view, it's more harmful and more punishable to ruin the church than the residential house, for example. Not because the religious building is valuable, but because when you ruin a religious building, this is deprivation of people from the possibility to pray, which is violation of one of the fundamental freedoms. One of the fundamental human rights. And the international criminal law says that the religious freedom of civil population and religious freedoms of those people who are not combatants, but who are, for example, wounded soldiers who are prisoners of war should not be violated, and vice versa. They should be provided with the right to pray. And since in Ukraine there is pluralistic approach and almost absolute freedom of faith, then in Russia the approach is much more rigid, not only in the context of the Russian world ideology, but also due to the more rigid structure of power. That's why that offensive on the religious freedoms, even via attacks and shellings of churches and bombardments of churches, it results actually on this huge violation of the basic human rights. And of course, we understand that under occupation, many religious organizations which are banned in Russia, they will be banned in the occupied territories too. Nevertheless, understanding this fact, we have to register, as of the moment, only the ruination of the religious buildings. And coming closer to registration of crimes, to registration of evidence, to finding and establishing the evidence, it is quite a problem. And at the end, we will discuss the format of documenting, how to document properly. And it is not so easy to establish also the exact location of the damaged object, including the geographical coordinates. Our project, Religion in Fire, do not produce the map. We do not do mapping, but we have produced our own methodology of registering the fact of crime against the religious building. There are some aspects which we cannot investigate because we're civil society organization. For example, we cannot identify who committed the shelling, who has to be responsible, to be brought to responsibility for shelling. I mean that we all know that the damage was done in result of Russian shelling. Okay, but which specific detachment performed the shelling is not clear. This should be clearly established, and for doing this, we apply to the investigation bodies. Also, upon discussions with lawyers, we have understood that we have international criminal law offenses as to the religious and religious objects, but we do not have such a nomination of the criminal action against religion in Ukrainian national law. And as of the moment, it looks like the ruination of a religious building during war is just the act of vandalism, not like the criminal, not like committing a crime, war crime, during military actions. So in order to bring the perpetrators to responsibility, we need to have such a provision in our national law. So as a civil society, we are eager to assist the governmental bodies in doing that. There are many more nuances which become obvious in course of registering the crimes. For example, you have to establish whether the church was shelled one time or several times. Our trips around the Kiev region together with Viacheslav, sometimes we have to establish that the religious building was targeted twice. For example, in Irpin, seminary in Irpin, or Muslim or a mosque in Donetsk region, which were shelled once. Then a drone came, the enemy's drone came to observe the results, and another day they were shelled for the second time. And also we have to register if any religious object were targeted not randomly, but just on purpose. And this is one more type of war crime, when a religious object is targeted intentionally, not randomly. For example, in Mariupol, Khachkar was damaged, which can be an object of prayer, although it may be not a church, but nevertheless, it was destroyed, although it does not fall within this classification. Sometimes people pray in cemeteries, and again, when a cemetery is targeted, we do not classify it as a damage of religious object. And unfortunately, we will not have the full list by the end of the war. And when we deal with the number of shellings, when we register that a mosque in Donetsk was shelled once and twice, on the third day it was ruined altogether, and eventually it does not exist anymore. But despite all that desperate conditions, we have to register all such cases. all of us representing different arms of civil society and the state, we can contribute our specific effort to make this important thing together. To finalize with the stakeholders involved into this work, I would like to mention one more actor from the civil society. This is Coalition Tribunal for Putin. This is a coalition of those organizations which have been documenting the crimes of Russians. This is Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group, Ukrainian Helsinki Group, and some others. They've been doing this work on registration of religious buildings for 8 years. This is a specific section in the violation of the international criminal law. The latest report of the monitoring mission in UN on the international war crimes was devoted to the ruinations of churches, and international criminal law uses this data from the UN monitoring mission without further proofs. They take them as sufficiently proved. And this makes it easier to bring to responsibility, to bring perpetrators to responsibility if something is registered by the UN report. And what is also important, of course, we may wait till the full deoccupation of Ukrainian territory, but the data which we have as of now brings us to several conclusions. And I would like to emphasize these two conclusions. The Russian aggression is substantiated with references to some, so to say, religious values which have to take important place in today's political life in Russia. The leader of the Russian Orthodox Church substantiated the need to escalate in Ukraine, to occupy Ukraine, and at the same time we have to emphasize that the overall majority of damaged or ruined buildings, they belong to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchy. This is the church within the jurisdiction of Moscow Patriarchy. This shows how Russia defends its true church, and this demonstrates how the Russian Federation takes care about their fellow Christians, and that the ideological substantiation of the aggressor's actions is negligible. On the other hand, we see how many religious communities which were ruined, they are religious minorities actually. And quite often those religious minorities, they may have unique religious buildings like Karaim's community in Kharkiv, which was destroyed in March. Shows that that's increased attention and support given such a religious minority was challenged very much by the occupants. And again, this emphasizes that Russia's statements that it was Ukraine who restrained the religious freedoms shows that it is Russia who destroys religious freedom. For example, 2 synagogues were destroyed in Mariupol. Karaim's church was destroyed in Kharkiv. Mosques were destroyed in Donetsk and other regions. This once again shows that those explanations and pretexts which Russia uses for substantiation of their attacks, they are null and void and negligible, actually. That is what we wanted to state. Whether you have any questions, you may ask them. Good afternoon. I'm Kistiana Volodymyr. I'm a lawyer. My first question, whether there is any cooperations between the state authorities, civil society, and UNESCO employees, whether you provide your reports to UNESCO. And in the context of the European Court on Human Rights, you mentioned that it was not just about the damage committed to property. It was about the violation of the freedom of faith. And in this relation, my question, whether there are any precedents when the efficient satisfaction for damages on these grounds was awarded by court. The state service does not cooperate with UNESCO directly, but as far as I know, the Ministry of Information cooperates with them. Maybe my colleagues would correct me. Nevertheless, about precedents, it seems to me that positive precedents were about former Yugoslavia. There should be a special tribunal. There was a special tribunal on Yugoslavia, and there were positive decisions in terms of Bosnia. As for UNESCO, we do not cooperate with the UNESCO directly, but we contacted with the rapporteur of United Nations on the freedom of faith, and they produce regular reports. One of such report was done in autumn, and then in late spring. And Ukrainian information became part of the regular report. but in future maybe we will have direct cooperation. I never heard about cooperation with UNESCO, but I know about the contacts with UN Rapporteur on the freedom of faith, and also I heard about consultations with the UN Rapporteur on the minority rights and in the genocide prevention. And in the context of that issues, the violation of the freedom of faith was raised. And further question, I've heard that the payment of compensations could be done based on the decision of a tribunal, etc. But my question, whether it is possible to impose such contribution-based or compensation-based on the International Court on Human Rights, or and whether we should apply to this court on individual basis. So should such a submission made collectively by religious communities of Ukraine, or each religious community should do it individually? Thank you for the question. I'm not sure because I'm not a lawyer. And we should keep in mind whether Russia would agree with the court decision when it is made. In my opinion, the more court decisions are made, the bigger will be probability that something will be reached. As of now, I'm not sure about future tribunal as to Ukraine and Russia. And in my opinion, I think we should, as of now, rely on our own criminal code. And when we start thinking in this direction, we understand that we need to have the violation of the right to freedom of faith, and renation of religious buildings should be classified as the crime at the national level. I'm not sure that each religious community should apply to the international court. Maybe some very obvious and bright, the most representative cases. But in general, I think that the problems of the renation should be applied collectively. For example, if there is a shelling of Lavra, which is recognized as the UNESCO heritage, this brings in more probability that the court would pay attention at the case. Any further questions, if any? I have a question to Igor. Currently, we are at the beginning of the World War III, and it has started inside the Judo-Christian civilization, and Moscow Church tends to depict Ivan the Terrible, Russian Tsar Nikolai the First, Putin, Stalin, etc. Whether this could be seen as the act of Judeo-Christian civilization to find a decision to this issue. Thank you for this question. As to the Russian Federation, although it keeps saying that it's an empire and it dreams about coming back to empire, but this is actually fake. And even the values of the past, which it exploits, this is not a real past, but this is the structure of the past, the image of the past, which they had created. This is like the devil's logic. They call the good to be evil and the evil to be good. And they try to bring this good, which is evil, to the entire world. A church is in the center of this fake ideology. And if I look at the Orthodox, Russian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchy, it is not Christ-centered or even church-centered anymore. It is political centered church, and it consists of the external envelope, so to say, which is decorated with Ivan the Terrible, Nikolai the First, Putin, Stalin, etc. And this pushes out the image of Christ. On the other hand, this envelope, this shell, is filled with the ideology of war. And that's why we observe that the religious buildings are conquered. People are prevented from performance of their religious practices, and etc. That is what we had been observing for 8 years in the occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. We clearly saw occupation of religious buildings, then changing of the faith of denomination, which prays in worships inside this church, with the objective to change unique Ukrainian polyconfessional, multi-confessional landscape in order to build up the Russian-style image of the Holy Rus, as they call this. You are right when you say that this devil-style logic, this devil-style attack shows the intention of Russia not to contribute to the development of their own nation, but to attack other nations, to destroy the diversity inside other nations. And also we see the change inside the church, Russian Orthodox Church. Actually, this is a structural part of the Russian state, which has a religious appearance. This is a tragic situation, which indicates that even now the world becomes quite different from what we knew in the past. Actually, this proves to be a civilizational war of Russia against the entire civilized world. I would like to add a couple of words to this answer by Igor. That negative transformation of church in Russia, it is not only about the Orthodox Church, it is about all the religious communities and other denominations in Russia. For example, about Russian Protestants. Do we have questions from social networks? No, we do not have such questions. So my wrap-up answer to the last question. From the traditional Christian philosophical point of view, the best way to transform the reality or philosophical idea which you do not like, you should not reject it. You should perverse it. You should transform it into something opposite. So such a transformation from good to evil, that is what we observe in the today's Moscow Orthodoxy. And the crimes which we try to register, we do our best to register. This is actually the visual manifestation of that inner transformation, deep transformation, and actually the reflection of opposition in the universal level between good and evil. And let us finish with this. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you for your questions, and thank you to